of Afrofuturism, the imagination to change with Dr. Myron T Strong. We're so excited. My name is Andrea Frank, Associate Professor in Art and part of Eddie at New Paltz, here with my art student working away. I'd like to start off by thanking our colleague, Dr. Adrian Atterbury, who initiated this project and will introduce our wonderful speaker, Dr. Myron T Strong. The other Eddie collaborators on this project in two parts are, thank you very much, Sarah, Anthony Dandridge, and Zach Bowman. Eddie at New Paltz is a collaborative initiative focused on bringing transdisciplinary and creative learning opportunities to our community, which focus on just transition principles. Another collaboration we're holding is around health, wellness, and environmental justice with the Newburgh community. Please check out our website for events and opportunities to collaborate. Everybody's always welcome to please flow into this. On to Zach Bowman, who you met already, who will talk about next week's exciting part 2 of Afrofuturism, the Imagination to Change event at the Dorsey.
Thank you, Andrea, and hello, everybody. For those of you who are anywhere near New Paltz, I want to welcome you to visit an exhibition currently at the Dorsey Museum, Somewhere in Advance of Nowhere, Freedom, Dreams, and Contemporary Art, which really, a lot of the work in this exhibition is very much in line with all of the wonderful ideas that Myron's going to share with you today. It's curated by Nico Whedon and is on view through April 10th. So there's not much time to see it, but we do welcome you on Tuesday, April 5th from 7 to 9 p.m. to come and engage with the exhibition and create artwork in this space related to what you're seeing and also related to the things we've heard Myron talk about today. Just to briefly show you a little bit of a preview of the show, you can see that there are a number of works that are sculptural. There's tons of video. There are incredible installations, and I just really hope that you'll come. Be sure if you're coming on April 5th to wear comfortable clothes that you don't mind getting a little bit dirty. And also become hungry because we will have pizza. And anyways, thank you. I don't want to take too much more of your time. So welcome Adrian Atterbury, who will introduce Myron. Thanks, Andrea, and thanks everybody who's here.
So, thank you, Zach. Good morning. My name is Adrian Atterbury. I am a Prodigy postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Sociology here at SUNY New Paltz, and I'm here this morning to introduce our speaker. Dr. Myron T Strong is an award-winning sociologist who is currently an Associate Professor of Sociology at the Community College of Baltimore County in Baltimore, Maryland. He graduated with his Ph.D. in sociology from the University of North Texas in 2014. His research explores Afrofuturism, race, gender, and other social factors in modern comics and popular culture. In 2019, he won the Eastern Sociological Society's Barbara R. Walters Community College Faculty Award for his article, "The Emperor Has New Clothes: How Outsider Sociology Can Shift the Discipline," which is published in Sociological Forum. He also won the Innovation of the Year Award from the Community College of Baltimore County for his co-authored book, Sociology and Stories, A Creative Introduction to a Fascinating Perspective, which uses multiple lenses to frame the sociological stories that make up each chapter. His other published work includes a piece titled Race and Reality TV, which examines race within contemporary reality TV shows. He has also published several works that explore Afrofuturism within Black Panther. These publications collectively demonstrate how Pan Africanism and collective memory are important to understanding Black identity. Dr. Strong is a multifaceted and accomplished sociologist. He can be found on Twitter and Instagram under the handle @AllRealDeal. If you have any questions during the presentation, I ask that you ask them at the end of the talk, either by raising your hand or putting your question in the chat. Before we begin, I would also like to welcome those who are attending this talk from Durban University in South Africa. And on that note, I invite you to engage with Afrofuturism for the next hour. Without further ado, may I present Dr. Myron T Strong.
Wow, I appreciate the introduction, and I'm excited about the talk today. I think that it's important for us to learn how to engage and how to make social change, and that's something that I've been concerned with probably most of my adult life, right? So today, as we get started, and I'm going to share my screen, I'd like to talk about Afrofuturism. Right, so here we go. Right, Afrofuturism, the imagination of change. Okay. So let me see. Sometimes I wonder, should I like it like this mode instead of in presentation mode, but I know it's less distracting. In presentation mode, it's slideshow mode, so let me see. All right, so let's get started. So Afrofuturism, the imagination of change, is the title of this lecture. And I think when we're talking about how do we make change and how do we change the world, I think Afrofuturism is a great vehicle to sort of explore. So how do I get here, though? So as a kid, I stargazed a lot. I love to look up at the stars. And, you know, I didn't have a telescope, but I used to make my own telescope with my hands like this. The thing about Arkansas is, small town I'm from, there's like very few buildings and stuff. So you can see, and it's hard to imagine now the sheer amount of stars you can see in the sky. Like, it's amazing. You feel a part and you feel connected to the universe in a way I don't now that I'm in Baltimore, right? Now, one of these times, stargazing, my mother, and I actually don't remember this, but she recalls this story sometimes of me and her looking outside and we seeing a UFO. Now, why I don't remember this, and what is clear though, is that this incident, among others, was important in sort of triggering my imagination. Then why is the imagination important, right? Well, I like to quote Natasha Womack's book, Afrofuturism, the World of Black Sci-Fi and Fantasy, where she says, it's important because if you want a better world, we have to be able to imagine it. Because if we can imagine it, we can take agency. And if we cannot, we can't take agency. So the idea that we can change the world is rooted in the idea of our imagination. Now, as a sociologist, of course, I'm interested in how do we make the world a better place? The ways that institutions affect our lives, from housing, education, the government, etc. But I do so often know that there's a limitation often to the means in which we can understand the world. So I begin to focus and to understand that if I wanted to truly understand how to change the world as a sociologist, then I might need to understand how stories, both experienced, written, and told, change and open up possibilities. So, and I often think about a quote, and this is sort of a paraphrase from sociologist E. Ewing, who actually writes for Marvel and actually wrote the most recent version of the Ironheart comic. And she says, basically, I'm paraphrasing it, it is my research, so my social research with traditional tools that help me study the world as it is, but it's fiction that help understand the possibilities of what it could be. And when I think about how do we change the world, and when I think about trying to understand why things happen, I understand that while traditional methods of sociologists, as it is, if I want to get creative and understand the solutions, it's the stories that unlock us. It's one of the reasons at my college, we created a whole book called Sociology and Stories, where we basically used personal stories to teach sociology, right? And what we found is that that's much more effective in getting students to understand. I mean, I think there's something about it, the story that should not our imagination, but our intelligence and our creativity as well, right? So what is Afrofuturism? It's a broad topic, but think about it as a cultural aesthetic for some philosophy, science, history that explores the intersection of African diaspora with technology. So basically, think of science fiction, but with the Black experience, right? That's important, though, because once you shape that experience, it changes and molds the stories in our imagination in much different ways. The term was actually coined by Mark Deary in 1994, who happens to be white, but in terms of intellectualizing to the academy, and the stories go back decades and decades, it was Alondra Nelson who in the 1990s sort of led these conversations. And she's a sociologist. I think she's at Princeton now. She works with the science team for President Biden now as well. It was her work that actually put it as a sort of academic framework in terms of sociology, right? So it addresses, so Afrofuturism addresses themes and concerns of the diaspora using technoculture. Science fiction is such a beautiful way to study the world, right? And envision a world that's much different, right? So what is sort of the foundation, right? Often you think about Afrofuturism, you're thinking about Black alternative narratives of understanding experiences using some function of science fiction, alien abductions, time travels, future societies, other things. It often questions many of these sort of social factors that we've been exposed to, right? We know that historically, Blacks in the United States were at least initially considered 3/5 human, right? So it asks questions, who defines who's human, right? Who defines what's first world, second world, third world, right? It asks questions in a way social science doesn't ask. Who decides what groups have rights? It basically looks, though, at the world of what it is and how it can be transplanted by the world that never was or the world that could be. And I think that's important. So really trying to understand this even more, this ideal of science fiction being a vehicle for social change, I referenced Black to the Future. It was an essay written by Walter Mosley, who was a legend crime fiction writer. But he writes his essay in this Afrofuturistic anthology called Dark Matter. And he starts off and he basically says that he got into science fiction and fantasy and comics and all these things because the world is so much larger and has so much more possibilities than science can describe. Now let's think about that. It's so much larger and has so many more possibilities than science can describe. Yeah, and a quick aside, I actually was a scientist for 3 years. I worked under a NASA grant in college where I made alternative rocket fuel as well. So my own background has sort of led me to this sort of interdisciplinary understanding of art, science, English, and stuff as well. But there's definitely, as a scientist, I understood that there's a limitation, and reading stories and particularly science fiction adds so many more possibilities than we can even imagine. Anything from life on other planets to freedom, right? Science fiction and its relevant sort of counterparts, so we talk about horror, fantasy, and the like, are sort of these main arteries of imagination, is what he says. Now, to make this point, I think this is important. Many inventions first come through the imagination before science. If you think about submarines and space shuttles, these were things that were envisioned long before they were actual real things in science fiction. Cell phone, even a Black president, that was once science fiction, which is crazy to think about. So the importance of how science fiction, teleporters and all this stuff actually has a real life function for our own creativity. Now, the best sort of example of this, well, I get to that after this. So it basically says, and he basically said that Afrofuturism and science fiction in general is for the dreamers. It speaks to the people who are dissatisfied with the way things are, the people that want things to be better, the dreamers, the powerless. Particularly, we're talking about Afrofuturism and Blacks in America, you're talking about those cut off from their ancestors. Now, this is something that is important to remember because for Blacks in America, we start here. And I never understood that as much as the first time that I went to Egypt. So I went to Egypt in 2006. And when I went there, this is the truth. The air smelled better. The food tasted better. And, you know, it was just such a joyous feeling. And I didn't really understand why until I got back to New York. And the moment I got back to New York airspace, there was a tension that came here, right? And there's a lot of research that's talk about the idea that race is a real medical problem, right? It creates a real biological health problems based on how we're treating this kind of stuff. And no more than I understood that there, but also what I understood was I was limited in how I was thinking. So I came back changed because I began to connect with an ancestor and a part of myself that extended beyond just being enslaved here. So science fiction offers this. We're limited here by a lot of our social factors, but no one can limit your mind. The stories take you places, right? And it is the imagination that's the first step in sort of changing the world. Now, I know some of you all are reading different poetry in some of your classes, and the Ned Smiths, Don't Call Us Dead, sort of discusses the harsh reality of being Black in America, dealing with a lot of the police brutality and sort of the social evils. But within that as well, it's not just about the reality. The realities are being pointed out because the Nez wants to connect that these are the realities, but there is a reality, a possibility that's better if we understand the realities here. The same if you read like Audre Lorde, like poetry is not a luxury, right? Where in it she discusses the past, but she envisions poetry as a sort of magic, particularly for Black women, and as a way to use poetry to sort of embrace your power and sort of embrace your future. And once again, this is about sort of assembling dreamers, right? This picture here is from a comic called Tuskegee, the Tuskegee Heirs, which is, you know, based on the Tuskegee Airmen and their heirs and, you know, doing good and that kind of stuff. Now, a kind of real life experience is this, and what I'm talking about. 100-year Starship Initiative. So this is Mae Jemison, who she sounds like she's made up. She's so awesome. She's an engineer, doctor, and astronaut, first Black woman in space. Right. This is her being on an episode of Star Trek, and I thought it was interesting. She was younger, but it's an interesting merge where you have this incredible person that's been to space, that's done all this amazing stuff. That's a doctor, that's an engineer, who also talks about the idea of science fiction being important and being creative. Now, what's interesting is, and we're talking about science fiction be going from just the imagination to real world, right? A 100-year Starship is an initiative where within 100 years, and Mae Jemison leads the project, they want to build a starship capable of leaving the solar system, right? Now, while this might sound good with science fiction, there is a sort of interesting reason Mae Jemison wants to do this. And it's not just because she loves space, right? She says, because the capabilities that are required to go beyond our solar system are the very same things we need to survive as a species on Earth, on this star system, meaning that Earth, what is the main capability we need? Sustainability. To create a starship to go past the solar system, you have to have basically an unbound power system. You'd have to be able to create food rapidly, effectively. You have to create healthy environment, clean air, all the things that you need here on Earth. So even though this is a real New World initiative, the real point is we're using science fiction and real science to create a better planet. It's a beautiful initiative, and it just talks about just the power of what can happen. Now, while I'm talking about Afrofuturism, there is also a vein of African futurism, which is different. Think about Afrofuturism arriving and deriving from Blacks here in the United States and our cultural realities. African futurism is saying to have a sort of different bloodline. So Nydia Okafor sort of notes that while Afrofuturism may be a subset of science fiction, it's very African futurism is very different, right? First of all, the cultural tradition is distinctly about African and being on African continent, right? And being a part of that particular cultural understanding, right? It also gives a focus primarily to Africans, which I think is important, right? So one of her, she has a lot of amazing work, but one of the most famous is Bendy. And if you haven't ever read this, you should look it up. But she basically says one of the key differences that departs from African futurism from like sort of Western sci-fi is that it's basically white, male, and hegemonic, right? So when we think about science fiction here, it's mostly centered on white people in there, right? Where African futurism is concerned about the technology and stuff that goes beyond just being about white male, right? That is centered on the continent, right? And it's rooted and it's foremost from the people of Africa. It's built on those myths, those traditions, which is very different. So think about it having a parallel existence with African and Afrofuturism, right? And like you said, it's really accomplished comics. She wrote Shiri comics. She wrote a lot of this, so you should check it out. I was just reading a story. You can kind of Google up the mother of invention. So yeah. Right, but you also see this elements otherwhere. So there was actually a South African produced superpowered show called Jungle, which very much was Afrofuturistic. In it, this guy gets this stone from his father's grave, and he sort of trying to figure out who killed his father. But what happens is he gets the stone, and the stone gets some power. Now, what you find out throughout the series is that the stone is actually alien in origin. And once again, we look at a lot of science fiction stories, this once again comes up. The idea that something's alien, right? There's something connected to a larger spiritual connection as well. So, but yeah, watched it a couple of seasons, came out in 2006, was really interesting. You can see here him embracing it, getting powers, could run and jump and increase his speed and stuff. So you also see it in comics, talking about African futurism. This is a comic written by a Nigerian comic, Malika. You can't see it, but this is volume 1 and this is volume 2. Volume 1, she's in the 15th century, she's in West Africa. She frees West Africa. She falls asleep and goes to the future, and then she's partners with other powerful women and, to save Africa and the globe, right? But once again, you have time travel, you have going to the future, right? You have mystical powers, right? All of these things we can relate to because it makes sense, right? Right. One of the things we're attracted to when you're talking about power is these characters have the ability to change things, right? In a way that we may feel like we don't, right? But if you give us powers, if I'm super strong, if I can fly, if I can go invisible, then I can change things. And that's something we think about, we can relate to our own lives, right? So what's interesting, and I almost have to mention the movie Black Panther because it sort of created this resurgence in Afrofuturism. And it was definitely Black Panther that actually got me into Afrofuturism, right? And like Afrofuturism focuses on the idea that basically science fiction and stories in general have systematically neglected and narrow blackness, right? You have very stereotypical perceptions and very limited understandings of our lives, right? It also put forth this idea of the fictive kin. So when we talk about the diaspora, we're talking about the connection between people who have descents from Africa all over the world. And this idea of fictive kin comes up as well, where there's a connection between African Americans and Africans and other Black people around the globe, not formed necessarily from DNA, but from shared experience, right? So the sociologists, we understand that race is not real. Gender's not even real. They're constructs. Then from real in terms of biology. When we're socially, they made them very real, right? And because we have shared experience, because people treat groups a certain way based on skin color, based on other social factors, there is a shared experience that happens, right? And if you look at Black Panther, one of the reasons I think it was successful because it emphasized that this isn't just a movie about Black people in the US, it's about Black people in the world who've been victims of colonization, and these are the mechanisms which you can change. Right? It connected sort of this alien and spiritual ideal and sort of put racial struggles at the forefront. Right? One thing it does, and this is we'll talk about it in a little bit, but this is something very common, and actually it's foundational in African and Afrofuturism, is the idea that powerful women are decoupled from European understandings, right? And celebrated our past and present and future in a way that Europeans don't, right? So the film's ability to sort of imagine a futuristic alternative uncolonized Africa provided audiences with positive portrayals of Africa beyond the stereotypes of civil war, violence, disease, famine, social ills. Now, it was interesting, if you were there the first night, it was a beautiful, almost what Durkheim would say, collective effervescence, religious sort of experience, as people all connected through the film, through the ancestry. So you would go, you would see theaters, you would see these are some kids here dressed up, right? Sit on the front row excited. There's some pictures, some people dressed in what they would see as traditional African garbs. Here's some people doing the same and just being very sure, like, yes, we are extra. Yeah, right? Like, we're embracing it. This is us, right? And it was an interesting way to connect, because I think it was the first film where people flocked to that left with a super positive perspective of what Africa is and was, like, in a way that we haven't, because most of the films we've seen have been white savior complexes, films of whites are conquering it, or people being enslaved, or very stereotypical portrayals, right? So this allowed an interesting way to celebrate being Africa and African ancestry in a way that I hadn't seen in a movie. It's completely significant in how it shifted things. So yes, I was there and I was extra, and so was everybody else. So when you're talking about the imagination, then you're talking about then this sort of Afrofuturistic vision of past, present, and future, rooted in the understanding that Blacks in all social and physical locations, right, have a right to sort of fight oppression. It also emphasizes the idea that the imagination is our only limitation, right? And imagination brings agency, right? So if you have a problem, for instance, and you can think of how to get out of it, you can never solve it. But if you can imagine it, then you can maybe create a solution to give you agency. And by agency, that's like the ability to change your own situation, right? And which I think it does, without question. It also creates this understanding of intersectionality, right? Definitely of how women are viewed, but also in the way in which we critique society. So where Afrofuturism sort of extends to sociology, it provides a sort of intersectional perspectives, right? Simultaneously exploring multiple issues and oppressions. So Eric Stevens, AKA Killmonger, I put a villain because it's interesting, because if you watch the movie and after the movie, a lot of people didn't see him as a villain. They actually related to him much more than they did to T'Challa, right? Now, what's interesting though, if you examine him, and this is sort of how it expands sociology, instead of a very narrow, flat character that you're usually exposed to, examining Killmonger means you have to also look at the roots of the American institution, housing, education, social neglect, racism, that's the CIA. But his experience is framed within a long history of patriarchy, oppression, military training, and racial socialization. So when I talk to my classes and we talk about the film, just this one character expands on how we look at society in a way that traditional sociology often does. You also see it from The Watchmen. If you didn't catch The Watchmen, another incredible piece of Afrofuturist literature here. It was a limited HBO series based on the comic The Watchmen. And it basically framed through the Tulsa Race Massacre, commonly known as Black Wall Street. And basically, that's the frame of the show, the beginning. And it basically, the whole show just deals with the legacy and the consequences of that particular massacre, right? So issues of history, reparations, family, loyalty, gender, race, immigration, all build sister knights, who's played by Regina King's identity, but also begins something that you begin to learn, like in general. All right. So also, one of the things you notice is the importance of like spirituality. And you have to begin to sort of think beyond a sort of necessarily religious tradition and think about spirituality as a better acknowledgement and be able to think about and connect with your past. This is one of my favorite frames from Black Panther, right? The colors and T'Challa's marching toward, he's in sort of the spiritual world, marching toward the Panthers. He's looking for guidance, he's looking for knowledge. He's able to turn to his ancestry. He's able to turn to the spiritual in a way of understanding. He gets here and there's his father. But if you're interested, look at the former Black Panthers. Women of the group, which is very different how Europeans see it. And this is one of the things that we're going to talk about secondly, out of the divine feminism, that separates a lot of Afrofuturism, African futurism from traditional writing in general, right? That's very white, patriarchal, and paternalistic here, to a more egalitarian, well-rounded view, where the only thing in common is that women can choose their own paths. People can choose their own paths, right? So you can see this muscle, but there's also this connection to the past as a way of guiding, right? There's a saying in Sankofa with among the Akan people, which is a group of people in Ghana that basically says, you know, it's characterized by a bird with a head turned backwards with an egg in its mouth. And it's basically saying that you must like understand the past to live in the present to know the future, right? At the heart of all these stories then is the myths and the stories of our culture that fuel us, right? Right, you can use it, right? If you go into the comics, and once again, comics is sort of my main genre of studying at this point, you see a lot of these spiritual characters. So the first run of Black Panther with the Ta-Nehisi Coates writing it, Shuri was sort of this being that occupied this world between the spiritual and physical world, right? And revered sort of as this goddess mother. So here's some comics I think that get around to a lot of this, right? You got Bitterroot, Afrofuturistic comic about a family in Harlem in the 1920s that fights like Ghostbusters kind of thing, right? You got the original run of Black Panther with Ta-Nehisi Coates that deals with Shuri, but other aspects. You have The World of Wakanda, which deals with Dora Milaje breaking off particularly based on being dissatisfied with the Black Panther, and Kinsey here, sort of the antagonist that's also a very spiritual and powerful person, right? That's confused and stuff. So a lot of different issues wrapped up. You should check out the comments if you're interested. Other things you see as well. Naomi She Is Not, same different thing. It's a comic by Stranger Comics that deals with and this is interesting. This is the first comic that had a Black woman writer, illustrator type. It was Black women doing everything, right? And it was based on, at least the first run of Niobe was based on the actress that played Rue in the Hunger Games. She's been on The Hate You Give now. She's been going now stuff. So yeah, Shuri with Nettie Okafor wrote this run of the comic. Ironheart. No, these are just examples you can see. Afrofuturism and comics that deal with a lot of the traditional like tenets of Afrofuturism. So one of the most powerful though, and I've referenced it previously already, is the idea of the divine feminism. Right? So Afrofuturism and basis of divine feminism is the idea that women themselves have complete agency over both their lives and choices that they make. This is something very not happening in European literature, right? You see elements of the divine feminism and comics and presentations and pictures, but this interesting collection of power, technology, spirituality comes across in many, many different pictures, and you can see sort of the different things. There's a face on the side of here. It's basically a city and something in their hair. There's lines, there's pipes, same thing, right? This sort of embracing, right? Even the fact that when you go back to the Black Panther, it was the goddess Bass that gives Panther the power, right? Which is very interesting because a lot of traditional religions are actually gynocentric, right? While the predominant religions now are basically patriarchal, right? There's a male godhead and all this kind of stuff. A lot of traditional religions were not like that, right? Which is interesting because then how does that shape your understanding if the creator God's a woman under the tradition? So there's a lot of interesting things about that. You can see some other physical representation from the movie, right? Very much against sort of the traditional way in which we've been told to present. There's an ideal of agency. If you remember, the general, Okoye, you remember she actually confronted her like partner who was trying to like go against like Wakanda. She's like, nah, that's not gonna be. She was actually considered also the most powerful warrior, including the Panther in Wakanda. There's this beautiful scene, well, two beautiful scenes, right? She goes into the casino and she has on this like long stringy wig, and she's like, man, I can't believe this sort of commentary on Eurocentric ideas, right? Shiri called the one white dude in the movie The Colonizer and all this kind of stuff. It's a really interesting embrace. Now, what's interesting though, and I recently wrote a book chapter about this, is when you look at the Dora Milaje, that even though they're these fictional warriors, they actually are a legacy of traditional groups in Africa, right? Particularly when you're talking about the Dahomey of Benin, but other groups as well. So I actually write about some groups. I won't go into a lot now, but you can see some of the interesting pictures here. I think we have to understand the importance women play in warfare. As a matter of fact, in Male Daughters, Female Husbands, Ifeanyi Dume, she's talking about how in 1929, the British came to Nigeria to try to conquer it, and they couldn't. And they basically said they couldn't because the women were the most militant women in the world. So they went to Nigeria thinking something, and women started putting them hands on them. And they was like, shoot. So it was interesting, right? So there's a long history. Here's some more pictures you can see. So I think this is important as well because once again, it connects to this sort of diasporic understanding. Where even if sometimes I don't understand what I do, it's interesting how it's connected. Yeah. All right. So that's the thought. So Afrofuturism in general gives us sort of a more robust, complex understanding, right? It encourages us to take a broader institutionary approach and focus on the Black experience. It can be argued also that it creates a sort of path of discussion for other people of color as well. So as a sociologist, I feel like that we have to adapt and we need to sort of challenge these sort of old paradigms while sort of integrating approaches that put people of color at the center. Once again, it's about the stories. And I often think about stories that I was told as a youngster. And one of the stories is this idea of the flying African, right? So it wasn't from this book. This book came out in actually 1994, but there is a long tradition in the South, particularly stories of where those trapped on ships would jump off and fly home, or those enslaved in the South would jump off cliffs and fly home. And there was this sense of not only standing up to the sort of social system, but also creating a sense of freedom to return to that which you came. And that story sticks with me. And I think about it a lot when I sort of examine why am I here, right? So yeah, so I just like to end, and I like to end with a phrase you remember. And I just want you all to imagine a better future. I mean, if you take nothing else from this lecture, I want you to use your imagination to think about that there can be a better future, and think about ways in which stories can allow us to extrapolate on them. Okay, so thank you. Open to any questions you all may have.
So thank you, Myron, for such an insightful and meaningful presentation. That was awesome. Thank you. So for anyone who has any questions, you can put them in the chat function, or you can raise your hand. But to start us off, I'm going to ask you a question, Myron. So my question is, what are some of the ways that we can engage with Afrofuturism in our daily lives?
Well, actually the easiest ways I think is to put Black people and Black people experiences at the center of how we begin to understand, and be trying to begin to have a more rounded understanding of life that includes a more social understanding, right? So in our daily lives, as we go on and we try to understand things, we have to begin to think about the ways in which we've been shaped by systems, but also the stories we've heard that help us create a sense of freedom, you know, and make the world a better place, and sort of embracing who we are, particularly if you're a person of color. And I think that's something that there's so much about this society that wants to force you not to be who you are and wants to define you, to continue to embrace who you are, accept who you are, and love who you are. And I think if you can do that, particularly if you're a person of color, but if you're anyone, I think that you're doing the tradition right. And believing in egalitarian traditions over patriarchal ones.
Thank you. So I see that we have a question from Anthony. Would you like to unmute yourself? Okay.
Peace, family. Peace, family. Thank you for everybody being here. But Dr. Strong, thank you so much for taking us on this journey. I learned a lot, and I think that the work that you're doing is very important. The question that I have for you is, given your understanding of Afrofuturism and the way in which it has an impact on our communities, societies, and different things like that, would you consider it as an inherently political form of expression?
Oh, good question. Good question. I think that anytime you challenge the social norm is political, right? And you're a professor, I'm a professor. A lot of times, literally just walking into the class, that's already a political statement, right? I often joke with my students that if George Washington, Thomas Jefferson could see me now, they'd walk in, they'd be like, what in the heck are you doing here? Boy, go get me a fresca, right? The idea that we mean something is important. And one of the ways I understand this even more is when I went to the UK, now out of 14,000 full-time professors in the United Kingdom, only 50 were Black. So you have large segments of the United Kingdom that have never seen a Black person with a Ph.D. So when I went there, I was almost like something of an aberration. They was like, you Black and you got a Ph.D.? So that statement also talks about, okay, opportunities, action, environments, right? So back inherently just being who you are, there's often a challenge. So yeah, but I do think that there's an important notion of embracing who you are, because no matter who you are and what you do, there's going to be some segments that go against it. So being comfortable and connecting largely to who you are, I think is important.
There's a question in the chat from Annie Rochelle. She writes, do you have suggestions about how we can integrate Black futurism literature into sociology classes?
And
Yeah, I mean,
I'm pretty sure we met at the ESS, right?
You know what? I told Adrian that. I told Adrian that we was at the same round table years ago.
Yep.
I told him that. Yeah, I was telling him that the other day. We did. Nice to see you. I mean, I think I'm actually developing a textbook and a syllabus now. And I think, and I do comics in general, and I just think there's a lot to offer students in understanding things in a way. Like, so if you want to tell people that your social systems matter, we can give them a bunch of stuff, or you can show them an episode or let them read a comic and makes more of an impact, right? So I think that adding fiction and nonfiction, which is what I begin to do more in my classes, helps us sort of understand in a way that traditional text, and traditional text is sometimes boring to students, right? So having them read traditional texts and ideas, like, for instance, I had my race class, we framed the whole project around Du Bois is the comic. W. Du Bois, legendary scholar and sociologist, wrote a bunch of nonfiction, and he wrote a story that's considered Afrofuturistic now. It was just a story to him called The Comet, in which is basically this Black guy in Harlem go to this bank, doesn't have a name, they just call him the messenger. Gets trapped in the vault, a comment happens, and everybody disappears except him and this white woman. And so he's a sort of messenger and a sort of harbinger of the talking about things about race and these sorts of things and the social problems and these sorts of things. So yeah, so we use the voice of the comment in class to understand about the social understanding, but also science fiction in general works. I often show the episode of Nosedive of Black Mirror. Black Mirror is a show on Netflix, Nosedive. Now, it's not necessarily Afrofuturistic, but it does get to the point of how science fiction can help you understand. So if you're curious, look up Black Mirror and Nosedive. But basically, it's an episode where basically your whole life you're getting rated. Everywhere you go, people rate you 1 to 5. And based on your ratings, it gives you access to stuff. Well, when you think about credit rating, that gives you that, right? You try to apply for something, you look at the numbers, depending on your rating, you're either approved or not approved, you can't get something. If you look on dating apps, all these kind of stuff. So ratings are already dictating our lives. But to tell them that was very different than actually seeing them watch Nosedive and they can actually see it, and it was able much more than for them to rate. So Black No More, another book that I haven't read. So yeah, so there's a lot of ways you can introduce stories to talk about a lot of these social. I even use crime fiction as well. So I'm gonna stop talking. Next question.
Okay, so we have a question from Benita Bobo. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Maybe put in the chat, maybe.
Hi, it's actually not me. I think it's one of my students who have logged in using the same link as me. So I'm not sure which student of mine it is. So if they could go ahead, please. Thanks.
No.
Okay, please go ahead and ask the question. All right, so unfortunately, I cannot hear you. So if you could put the question in the chat, that would be great. We do have several questions in the chat. The first one comes from Precious Stone, who asks, could you comment further on how many people don't see Killmonger as a villain? Also, could you imagine an alternative ending in which Killmonger and Black Panther somehow team up?
So the first part is, can I talk about people not seeing him as a villain?
Yes.
Right, because, all right, so Killmonger represents a frustration many people have with systems that you can't change. To watch the movie, his whole goal, the entire movie, is to get to Wakanda, and not necessarily to connect, but to use their weapons to create freedom. And I often talk about this quote from Toni Morrison. It's sort of my own mantra, where Toni Morrison, before she passed, she said, she used to tell her students, now, when you get these fancy degrees, there's a responsibility. If you're free, you have to free someone else. If you have power, you have to empower someone else. This just isn't a candy grab bag game. And I think that sort of sums it up. I think relating to Killmonger is relating to the idea that there is a somewhat a sense sometimes that that through a collective identity that it's on us to change our reality, right? We can't turn to the police, we can't turn to this. So there's an interesting sense of agency that I think that people understood, right? And I think that's important for us to understand, right? And the second part of the question was what, Adrian? I forgot the second part.
Okay.
It was.
The second part of the question is also, could you imagine an alternative ending in which Killmonger and Black Panther somehow team up?
So one of the things, now, we're not too sure that actually doesn't happen. Well, when Black Panther 2 comes out, there's a lot of speculation there. Because we didn't see, anytime you don't see a person die, you know how it is. And they might come back. But yeah, I think what's interesting about that part is the idea of restorative justice. And I'm gonna use Baltimore. So I'm from Baltimore, and in Baltimore schools, they had a lot of problems with discipline and these kinds of things. So instead of doing the traditional method, a lot of schools went to meditation. They went to yoga. So students would cause a disruption, they go to the meditation room, what they found. So what I think Killmonger and T'Challa represented, even if Killmonger died, was an ideal of restorative justice. because it was never T'Challa's goal to put him in jail. Even after everything he had done, he was like, we can save you at the end of the movie. We wanted to save him, right? So me imagining them two working together is me imagining a different way and sort of processing how we think about justice, right? In which if you have innocent until proven guilty, then why do you have to pay bail? Which is some of the current debates within law, right? Because poor people can't pay bail, and the longer you're in there, you're more likely to admit to a crime, right? So so that's sort of where I go when I think about just alternative ways in which we begin to police is the wrong word, but apply justice, right? And there's this really famous scene on Saturday Night Live with Black Jeopardy. If you haven't looked at it, look it up, where T'Challa's on there. And it's funny because they're basically basing on stereotypes. And Black people, according to the thing, don't like police, right? So, and they're asking, all right, so the police come by asking for questions, and all the other Black people are like, no, I ain't gonna say nothing. And T'Challa's all naive, like, yeah, I think we should work with our Minister of Justice because they have our best interests in mind. And I often show that in class, and I think that's sort of a beautiful scene in terms of envisioning a new way to sort of think about justice, one which we're not afraid, but we actually work together with elements to make this place a better place. And I actually saw a lot of that when I went to Cuba, but that's another story. Okay.
Okay, there's a question that comes from Jay, who writes, Dr. Strong, thank you for taking the time to teach us about this powerful and important concept. Do you think that the massive success Black Panther had in 2018 is merely the beginning of gaining stronger influences of Afrofuturism on the media we consume today or will consume in the future?
Oh, without question. I mean, when you look at the amount of stories being told that are rooted in Afrofuturistic ideas, yes. You have The Watchmen that comes out. You have Lovecraft Country. You have Them. You have Naomi that's on the CW now. You even have them replacing Batwoman with the Black woman, and her team's all Black. And the moment they did that, the narrative of the show changed. So it went from just somebody being Batman's cousin as Batwoman to being someone who's critiquing the foster system, who's critiquing the criminal justice system, who's critiquing issues of sexuality and these sorts of things. So yes, you see it with the rise of, like, there's a lot of graphic novels, like John Jennings he just produced one for the Met, but he's on, like, Kendrick as a graphic novel. Parable of the Sow is a graphic novel. So the ways in which you see comics and books and TV, yes, there's a moment here. I think our collective voice and our collective experiences can be shared. All right. And I think that, yeah, part of our growth as a society and sort of critiquing systems comes from integrating the perspective of not just Black people, but people of color in general as well. And Afrofuturism and African futurism is a great way to sort of do that, right?
Okay, thank you. And there's a question from Estelle Appia, who asks, do Pan-African and Afrofuturism work together? Like, are they almost exactly the same?
I mean, so when you think about Afrofuturism, you're talking about stories written from a diasporic Black Atlantic tradition, which is Pan-Africanism, right? The movement of Pan-Africanism was this idea that around the world, Black people around the world are connected through the shared experience. Now, from that shared experience, migratory movements, writings happen, but Afrofuturism then, particularly focusing on sci-fi and sci-fi kind of stories, begins it's a sort of voice to Pan-Africanism, as we can say, right? If you think about even something like Beyonce's Black is King, which I'm not gonna lie, the first part of that had me in tears a little bit. And I wasn't even a big Beyonce fan, but it was so beautiful and incredible. If you think about some of the music by Janelle Monáe and Missy Elliott and some of these even futuristic ways in which videos and stuff touch and to make us think about things beyond that. Yes, definitely. So yeah,
Okay.
so there is this connected. Well, so I was going to say, so Pan-Africanism was the larger movement. Think about Afrofuturism being the sort of voice of that movement. Okay. I'm sorry, Adrian, I'm ready.
Oh, no, I'm sorry for almost cutting you off there. I just want to ask, are there any more questions from the audience? All right, so with that, I would like to thank Dr. Myron T. Strong for delivering such a powerful presentation. I would also like to extend a thank you for everyone for attending today's talk, as well as to those who helped make this event possible, including the Dorsky Museum and Eddie, Zach Bauman, Andrea Frank, Sarah Wyman, and Anthony Dandridge. So please join us next Tuesday, April 5th from 7 to 9 p.m. at the Dorsky Museum to continue our engagement with Afrofuturism. Have a great day and rest of your week. Bye.
Thanks, Dr. Strong.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How you doing? It's good to see you. It was a long time ago, right?
I know, it was a long time ago. I still remembered you because I brought it up to Adrian. I was like, yeah, I think, and because I remember you saying particularly, you put your colleague on the paper so they could go to ASA.
That's right. Free trip.
Exactly. You took care of them. You took care of them.
Yeah, that's how
Yeah.
New Paltz. Yeah. By the way, you know, I used to use the Watchman, the original one, in my seminar as a thing of urban decay and apocalyptic stuff. And I started to use that. I was going to use it this semester. I wasn't able to do it, but the graphic novel Wake.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
amazing, right? The slave world. So this was really helpful to me to start thinking about more ways to integrate it. So I'll probably email you if you're not famous to reply.
I got your back. Yeah, I'm trying to write up a couple articles that talk about comics, because comics in general, actually, in 1944, the Journal of Education and Sociology wrote a whole issue on using comics in the classroom. So this was like 70 years ago. Sociologists saw the value. Right then, psychologists came along and connected it to like deviant behavior, and people left comics alone. But yeah, people have used like American Born Chinese, and actually him talking about how he got into comics and stuff is really interesting. Yeah, I've used like The Watchmen. If you're interested in the story of The Watchmen, I have it all on Google Drive. I loved it so much, I taped it and put it on my Google Drive. And I've definitely shown elements of that and stuff like this. So yeah, I just think it's so important to be able to touch our students, which is why we wrote the book about stories as well. Right, well, and if you're interested, I'll send you a copy of the book. But yeah, it's good.
No, I'll buy it. It's fine. I'll buy it.
I'll see the link. I'll see the
I
link
just
then.
looked it up, so I'm gonna get it.
Yeah, so it's the community
That's very
college
generous.
version. Right, it's the community college version.
Oh, okay.
And
All right.
yeah, we have like sociologist SpongeBob and all kinds of stuff. And actually, I write that to explain social theory to them. Right. So yeah, beautiful way. And so we have the students read that as a secondary text in the intro. They don't even read the traditional intro text anymore. They all just read that. It's like, oh, we get it. So yeah. So I was excited that you all brought Adrian in, who's such a dynamic scholar and stuff. So
I feel very privileged to be here. Like I love New Paltz, and I tell everyone every time I meet, I'm like, I love this department. I enjoy being here. So, it was my first choice and I got lucky. So yeah. And I get the chance to do cool things like, bring, dynamic speakers like you, Myron. So like, I still can't get over your presentation. Like I love it so much.
We're the ones that are lucky, Adrian.
Right.
Thank you,
I
Andy.
appreciate that. Because of you, Adrian, I really wanted to do a good job. Like I told you, there's a story where I was actually giving a presentation. I was doing a presentation while I was on the panel for the presentation. I went up there, like, hey, put me last. And while everybody else was going, I was actually doing my presentation. So this is actually what I value. I took a lot of time to thought about the ways to connect and stuff like that. So I was inspired by you.
Yeah, well, I can tell, like, just from the quality of the questions that were asked, like, you really got students thinking, right? And, this is going to definitely, I mean, we already planned an event, afterwards based on, your talk, where it's like, we're going to ask them to engage creatively in some way in Afrofuturism. So I don't know, this just all really fits in very well to, what we're trying to do here on campus. So again, thank you so much. And yeah, that's all. I'll be in touch, Myron. I always am.
I appreciate it. And I appreciated everyone. And so y'all thinking of me for real. It was a great experience. I mean, you gave me a reason to cancel class. So I mean, if anything, y'all deserve that. I'm like, just come to the intro. We ain't gotta teach. I ain't gotta teach. Just come to the lecture. So yeah.
Well, if this can benefit you in any way, I'm happy to hear that. All right.
Yeah, before I go, so Precious is actually from my college. She's an English professor here. So when you write this up, you can say that you had people from like Durban and community college of Baltimore County, and because all that stuff is important. I know how it goes. Because that's what I'm gonna say when I write it up. I'm gonna be like, everybody from everywhere was there.
Yes, no, I mean, I counted, like, at the peak, there were about 145 people just, on Zoom itself. And because I think there were at least a couple, watch parties going on, Myron, because I know, this matters for you and you have to count this. I want to say you probably pulled in about like 160 people, if not slightly more, but that's just a guesstimate. 145 for sure, possibly like 160. So this was very well attended. So those are things like you can use.
Yeah. So if anybody want a copy of the article I wrote for Context on Black Panther and the chapter I just did on the Dora Milaje, connecting it to like women warrior groups in Africa, just let me know. Just email me and I'll email you a copy. And also, you're talking about interest in Afrofuturism. I just tweeted out last week. So the article I wrote in 2009 for 2019 for Context has like 13,000 views, downloads. It has 13,000 downloads from the journal site. It's like among the top 5 of all downloaded articles in the world. 13,000. That's just from there. If you talk about ResearchGate, actually, we're talking about like 16 to 17,000 downloads, and people using it in classes. So there is a desire for students and professors to sort of touch students in different ways. So yeah, so you can just check it out. All right.
Okay. All right. Well, I mean, I've read that article. I enjoy it. And I'm going to figure out how I can incorporate it into future classes. Which, yes, on that note, I do have to prepare for because I'm teaching this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Well, enjoy the rest of your day, Myron. And again, thank you so much for everything that you did for today.
No problem. And if you have the link, when you get the link, do you mind emailing me? Emailing me the link to the lecture?
I can actually send you the recording.
Oh, cool. Would you do that? I appreciate it.
Okay, we'll do that as soon as I get off of this.
Thank you, everyone, once again. Email me if you have questions, and I really appreciate it.
Did you want to put your email in the chat?
Oh, yeah, I guess I should do that, right?
Yep.
All right, let me just put my email in the chat. Make sure it's correct. There you go.
Okay, and then your Instagram and Twitter handle, all real deal?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they could just follow me there.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I'm going to leave the meeting. Thank you again.
All right.
Myron.
Thank you.
Thank you, Myron.
I appreciate y'all bringing me in. Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
All right, bye.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you.
Peace, family. Make your day great.